I would like to welcome everybody today to our conference on religion and genomics, navigating pathways and perspectives of patient care. I'm Ellen Wright-Clayton. I'm one of the principal investigators of this project, and I want to get started on time because we have a lot to do today. Religion is a concept that is enormously important in our culture. It affects not only people's most intimate personal beliefs about how they interpret their lives, their commitments to their faith, many domains of how they act. It also is enormously important in our culture and in our political system. At the same time, genetics, as we heard about yesterday, the ways in which genetic variation contribute to individual diseases, as Professor Cowan pointed out last night, in diseases such as Tay-Sachs disease, sickle cell disease, beta thalassemia, Huntington's disease that came up in our discussion, some of the breast cancer genes that came up in our discussion. We have made enormous advances in this area where we think not only about the variation at individual points in our DNA, so-called genetics, but looking across our entire genetic makeup or our genome, leading us to talk now about genomics, thinking about the way our whole genetic variation across all of our DNA contributes both to health and disease. This concept of genetics and genomics and the enormous advances that we made in understanding their contributions to health and disease is not only important for individual patients, but it's had enormous salience in our public discussion. It has become an icon in our culture, and even the youngest child can identify a double helix. On a broader scale, we talk about the roles of genetic discrimination, concerns about this issue, the roles of genetic variation in thinking about responsibility for behavior, both in terms of our health and increasingly in terms of criminal responsibility. The New York Times this morning has a front page article about getting DNA samples for forensic purposes off of cast-off cigarettes. So there's been enormous discussion, particularly in the last 20 years, about the importance of thinking about genetics and genomics in our culture. So we talk about these two enormously complex topics, religion, genetics, genomics, and they obviously have to intersect because of their mutual importance. And yet, it's really quite intriguing to realize how little work has been done to actually explore that intersection. Because of that, a number of faculty, staff, and students at Vanderbilt and Meharry Medical College 3 years ago began a project with the support of the Center for the Study of Religion and Culture at Vanderbilt University to begin to explore these intersections. And we began actually by telling stories, our stories, about how we think about these issues in our own lives, how they have arisen in our practices, and how we think about them both in conceptual terms, and beginning just to develop actually a dialogue where we could even talk with each other across disciplines about how these particular concepts intersect. We then began a project, the results of which you'll hear some more of later today, that began both to address these issues in a more rigorous conceptual way, and that also began a project of looking empirically about how religion and genetics, genomics intersect, particularly as it relates in the patient care context. I will tell you that we have only begun to explore this path. But early on in this project, as we began to do this work and began to unpack some of this complexity, we realized that it would be really wonderful for us if we brought in the leading scholars in the field across the United States who were addressing aspects of these issues, again, some conceptual, some empirical, some both, to bring them to join with us in this discussion. And to that end, we convened a group of scholars We met for the first time last November and had just an enormously robust conversation, again, beginning by sharing our work, and which culminates in the conference that that's going to take place in the next day and a half. Professor Cowan set, as I expected, fully expected, set a wonderful frame for this discussion yesterday. And so what we are going to be doing in the next day and a half is sharing our work to begin further to explore this landscape about how our conceptual understandings of religion, which turns out to be really complicated, and our empirical understanding about how these issues actually arise for real people who are dealing with these implications in real time, come together. Our goal for this conference is to move the discourse, and to, at the end of tomorrow, both to understand more than we do now, and to encourage dialogue with all of you, but also we hope to define next steps as we go forward. So we really have this is really an ambitious project that we are embarked upon here, but I just wanted to lay that framework. Now, before we begin today, and I turn this over to Joe Fanning, who's going to talk about some of the nuts and bolts about what we're going to do, I have a number of thank yous to make. First of all, we have gotten generous funding from a variety of sources, which I want to acknowledge. First and foremost is the Center for the Study of Religion and Culture here at Vanderbilt, which is one of our interdisciplinary projects that was launched about 5 years ago, and that has been enormously generative in trying to understand the role of religion in the cultural context of the United States. We also have received a grant from the Ethical, Legal, and Social Implications branch of the National Human Genome Research Institute, which is enormously helpful to us. The Dean of the School of Medicine is supporting us, and then of course the Center for Biomedical Ethics and Society, which Larry Churchill and I direct, are also providing support for this. I also want to say thank you for a lot of strategic support. Erica Johnson and Barbara Kaiser for the Center for Study of Religion and Culture have provided tremendously valuable support, as has Denise Lillard, the administrative assistant in our center for this project. But I cannot say enough about the support that is provided by Joe Fanning, who is going to be speaking to you next. Joe, who earned his PhD last month here at Vanderbilt, is in an absolutely spectacular dissertation defense, I will say, is the project coordinator for this. And there are many, many people who have contributed to this project. It really is a product of faculty, staff, and students at Vanderbilt in a really wonderful and generative way. But Joe has absolutely been the glue that has held this together, both in terms of directing our research, in terms of convening the group, et cetera. But the amount of work that Joe has put into getting this conference together has been absolutely tremendous. Every single great thing that you see about this conference is Joe. I mean, I'm just saying. So if you see Joe, who's going to, well, when you see Joe, he's standing up next to you, you'll know who he is. Be sure to tell him thanks, because this has just been a labor of love for him, and I just can't thank him enough for all the work that he's done to make this an absolutely amazing conference. So with that, I'll turn it over to Joe.
Good morning. Thank you all for being here. I wanted to add a couple more names onto the thanks. I wanted to thank Kyle Galbraith, Virginia Bartlett, and Diana Jones, some fellow graduate students who've helped out working the registration table and in numerous other little ways so things don't fall apart. So I really appreciate their help, and of course, all of the people Ellen mentioned. A few nuts and bolts about your packet, and specifically about the CME documents that some of you recognize and some of you are wondering what those are. Some in this room are going to be a part of this conference and get credit for it. So that's the continuing medical education component. And they should be on the right side of your folder. And it's crucial that you record the sessions that you attend. And it's also important that everyone, even if you're not doing this for credit of any sort, that you fill out the evaluation forms. Because the CME criteria for an event is in part, judged by the amount of evaluations we get back. So if you could, it follows along with each speaker and some pretty, simple circling of numbers. So I think you can handle it. And at the end of the conference, tomorrow at 12:15, if you would take those back to the registration table so that we would, we can have those and send those to the, the right people. And if you're this CME credit is for physicians specifically, but you can also get attendance credit for other healthcare professional continuing education bodies. So if you keep your attendance, it can be counted by them. And if you ask me any more than that about that issue, I don't really know anymore. So, okay. But a couple of people had that concern. I do want to emphasize that we do have a lot packed in today, so we're going to try to hold our presenters to their time limits so that we have plenty of questions. So that's a message to the presenters. And also to the questioners, don't ask 4 questions, just try to ask 1 so we can share the floor. And then also a couple of changes in the schedule. In case you were wondering if you were actually going to have to sit from 1 to 5 straight without a break this afternoon, we're not. We're going to end at 3:15 for that after lunch session so that we'll have a 15-minute break, so just so you know that. And the schedule says 7 o'clock for dinner, and we're going to start serving wine and hors d'oeuvres at 6:30 in this room, so that if you wander off and you start getting hungry before 7, there will be something here, just so you know that. I think that's all I have in terms of, if you have any questions, you can talk to me, during lunch if you have specific questions about logistics of the event. Methodological aspirations. If the central question of the conference is how to understand and respond to the interface of genomic and religious concerns in the clinic, then we are all charged with the responsibility of learning about this complex interaction that involves medical and religious professionals, patients and families, religious communities, and individuals and religious leaders. And more generally, this involves words, vocabularies, actions, gestures, histories, and norms, beliefs, and rituals. So one clinical case, if we were to examine one clinical case, we can bring out the richness of all these features into relief. So thinking about organizing a conference around this large set of issues challenged us to identify dimensions of these encounters that needed to be addressed. So I'm expressing them here as 7 questions. So what do we mean by spirituality and religion? Larry Churchill is the Ann Geddes Stallman Chair of Medical Ethics and co-director of the Center for Biomedical Ethics and Society at Vanderbilt Medical Center, and he also holds appointments in the Vanderbilt Divinity School and in the Department of Philosophy. His presentation will address the strategies for defining spirituality and religion responsibly and with humility. So question 2. What can we learn from specific histories and traditions about the values of religion and genomics in respect to health and healing? In the session titled Religion and Genomics, Sharing History, Sharing Healing, one of our objectives is to identify and learn from specific historical examples of how actual communities have coordinated genetic information and religious commitments in the pursuit of better health. Ruth Schwartz Cowan, who most of you heard last night in the opening lecture, is the Janice and Julian Bears Professor of History and Sociology of Science at the University of Pennsylvania. She's an internationally known historian of science who's done significant work in the history of heredity. Today, she will go into more detail about the Republic of Cyprus and how they've coordinated religious, governmental, and healthcare interests in the effort to prevent births of children with thalassemia. David Smith is the director of the Interdisciplinary Center for Bioethics at Yale University and professor emeritus at Indiana University in religious studies. He's a well-known religious, theological, and medical ethicist, and he will discuss the bearing of religion and genomics on some key themes in Christian thought: health, sin, and suffering. So what is happening in the clinic? So most of the research that has been done in the area of religion and genomics has been theoretical, or more specifically theological and philosophical. Very little research has been done to find out whether and how religious spiritual concerns arise in medical situations involving genetics. In the session titled Mapping Religion, Patients, Genomics, and Religious Pathways, the objective is to learn from new data and analyses about an almost completely uncharted territory. Virginia Bartlett is a doctoral student in the Department of Religion here at Vanderbilt and is currently doing research in the ethics of prenatal surgery. She quite simply has the best command of the 200-plus pages of transcribed conversations from our focus groups that Ellen mentioned that we conducted with healthcare and religious professionals. And she will present those findings from that data. Rolanda Johnson, an assistant professor in the School of Nursing at Vanderbilt, has done important research in understanding health-promoting behaviors, including how religious beliefs affect interpretations of health. In this session, she will report and discuss findings from a subset of our focus groups conducted with nurses and their experiences of religion in clinical situations involving genetics. Tina Harris is an associate professor in speech communication at University of Georgia, and she brings research experience in understanding how factors such as race, religion, and other socioeconomic dimensions influence attitudes about health and genetics. And she will present new data about lay public understandings of genes and disease. Anita Kinney is associate professor in the School of Medicine at the University of Utah, and she's an epidemiologist with clinical experience as a nurse practitioner. Her research includes the role of religious involvement and social support in socially and geographically underserved populations who are at risk for hereditary cancers. And she particularly focuses on the African American community. In this session, she will propose a model from empirical studies for understanding how religion and spirituality influence responses to the psychological distress of hereditary cancer susceptibility. Fourth question. So what are some of the key concepts and cultural pictures that influence how we think about genetics and religion? So dominant ideas and frameworks influence how we think about genetics and religion, whether we're in the classroom or whether we're in the clinic. In part 2 of Mapping Religion, the objective is to examine the conceptual infrastructure that is part of our cultural inheritance when we think about religion and genomics. Andrew Lustig is the Holmes Rolston the third professor of religion at Davidson College. Professor Lustig has an accomplished body of work in the area of religion and science, theological and medical ethics. In his talk today, he will combine his recent work on the fundamental category of nature with discussions of genetic enhancement and that include analyses of several Roman Catholic statements on the issue of enhancement. Mark Blyton is an associate professor in the Department of Medicine, Obstetrics and Gynecology, and Philosophy at Vanderbilt University. He has persistent concerns about how we understand ourselves as individual cells, and will propose today that our desire for genetic descriptions of ourselves is a kind of divination. Timothy Jackson is Associate Professor of Christian Ethics at Emory University. His research interests include moral philosophy and theology, especially the relationship between secular and Christian conceptions of truth, love, goodness, mercy, and freedom. His presentation brings in the important discourse of evolution and makes the argument that we cannot be reduced to our genomes, nor should we try to enhance them. Question 5. How do and how should the faith commitments of genetic service providers affect the way they undertake their professional role? In the session titled Healthcare Professionals and Religion, Is This Trail Off Limits?, Gail Geller and Charles Bosk and Joel Frater addressed the complex issues concerning healthcare professionals' responses to their own religious commitments in respect to genetic issues. Gail Geller is professor in the schools of medicine, public health, and the Bioethics Institute at Johns Hopkins University. Having spent over a decade conducting empirical research on the ethical and psychological implications of the Human Genome Project, Professor Geller will discuss findings about the role faith commitments play in the experience of genetic service providers. Charles Bosk is professor of sociology at the University of Pennsylvania and has done research in the area of genetic counseling and professional responsibility in healthcare. Joel Frater is professor of pediatrics and professor of medical humanities and bioethics at Northwestern University's Feinberg School of Medicine. His clinical activities include the care of acutely ill, hospitalized children and palliative hospice care for children. Professors Bosk and Frater argue that conscientious objection by medical professionals deserve greater scrutiny given the power structures in place. Question 6. How should religious concerns be addressed in communication and in decision-making about medical situations involving genetics? Rebecca Ray Anderson is Associate Professor in the College of Public Health at the University of Nebraska Medical Center and is a board-certified genetic counselor at Monroe Meyer Institute for Genetics and Rehabilitation. Her presentation draws in part from her compilation of doctoral statements from a wide array of religious groups entitled Religious Traditions and Prenatal Genetic Counseling. And she recommends in her talk that genetic service providers should invite patients to discuss their religious concerns. Otherwise, they will assume that this is off the table. Mary White is Associate Professor and Director of the Division of Medical Humanities for the Boonshoft School of Medicine at Wright State University. Her research interests include informed consent and decision-making models in genetics and the role that religious and spiritual concerns play in interpreting genetic information. Her talk focuses on the complexity of genetic decision-making and how religious and spiritual beliefs can contribute to the quality of that decision-making process. Last question. Where do we go from here? The last session is an acknowledgement that we are at the beginning of a learning process. Ellen Wright Clayton and Nancy Press will help us reflect on where we have been and where we need to go. Ellen Clayton is the Rosalind Franklin Professor of Genetics and Health Policy and co-director of the Center for Biomedical Ethics and Society at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. She has been interested in issues surrounding the ethical, legal, and social implications of advances in genetics and genomics for many years as both a scholar and a policymaker. Nancy Press is professor in the schools of medicine and nursing at Oregon Health and Science University and has been a major contributor in the development of the field of ethical, legal, and social implications of genetics. And you may hear the term ELSI today. ELSI is the acronym for Ethical, Legal, Social Implications of Genetics. Together, Professors Clayton and Press will discuss their observations of the conference and the pathways between religion and genomics that need further exploration. This conference values thinking about these issues from many perspectives, what many will call interdisciplinary or methodological pluralism. And from the outset, we envisioned a panel of presenters who approach these issues from different disciplines: history, theology, sociology, philosophy, and many other, anthropology. And we also hoped that the participants in this conference would express a range of viewpoints informed by their experiences as healthcare professionals, ministers, other clergy, patients, scholars, and interested citizens. Bringing together and coordinating different disciplines and viewpoints is a methodological aspiration, and in that it's not really easy to pull off. Some presentations, as well as some of your questions, may be easier to follow than others. And in this setting, the educational truism that there are no dumb questions is especially relevant, and at the same time, we must listen to others. So I want to just acknowledge that having different disciplines, having a diverse audience is a challenge, and it's one that we're embracing. It doesn't mean it's not going to be difficult at times, but it is our goal. Because people know different things about different stuff. So I'm going to borrow from Mark Blyton's paper here. Some of you may know more about the divine than DNA, and others of you may know more about gene sequencing than genuflecting. So let us learn together today. Thank you.
I'd like to take a crack at something that I think is an ongoing sort of preoccupation for the work that all of us do, perhaps a little more relevant to those whose work is trying to figure out what's going on in the clinic, but I think relevant actually to the entire enterprise. And it has to do with this question about how do you define spirituality and religion for research purposes. I'm trying out an acronym here. SPAR, for spirituality and religion. Think nautical. Don't think boxing. A spar, as you know, on a ship is a large pole on which rigging is hung. It is a major supporter of the weight that makes the vessel move. So think about something that carries a lot of weight and also is an organizing point for much that makes things go. Okay? So try that one and see if that works. And I want to begin with something for the back of your mind, which I take to be sort of a methodological principle in general for how we understand this work, or how I think we might well understand it. A quote from William James, "The Introduction to the Varieties of Religious Experience. A large acquaintance with particulars often makes us wiser than the possession of abstract formulas." My 20 minutes is in the form of 2 cautionary tales and a plea for humility. So when I'm getting to the second cautionary tale, you'll know I'm almost done. Here's an outline of my talk. This is the end of my PowerPoints. But you'll know where I am in relation to the talk by seeing exactly where I am in terms of 1, 2, 3, or 4. Defining spirituality and religion, or SPAR, and why it matters. In the year 2000, I was interviewing couples who were candidates for an experimental surgical procedure to close the backs of fetuses with spina bifida. This is a prenatal surgical procedure that carries a lot of risk, both to the fetus and to the woman, and so it has a very extensive informed consent process attached to it. I was serving as a consent monitor for this procedure in terms of how well are the couples understanding the risks and benefits of undergoing this. And after hearing an explanation of the risks, one candidate couple said to me, "This may sound weird to you, but after my grandfather passed away," and this is a young woman talking, she had actually missed her grandfather's funeral in order to attend the medical debriefing. She said, "After my grandfather passed away, I felt his presence like he was watching over me from heaven," meaning her and her fetus. "He's watching over us from heaven, and if I have this procedure done, he's not going to let anything happen to me." So I became worried that this young woman was perhaps minimizing the risks of the procedure, and so in an effort to better understand her interpretive scheme, I responded, "Is then your religion a big part of your decision-making about whether to have this procedure?" To which she replied, "Oh, no." And it turned out, in fact, that religion in the conventional sense of church-going or belief in a God played no part at all in her life. But she had a powerful awareness of being protected by her deceased grandfather. So what I encountered here, I would submit, is not religion, but spirituality. This exchange echoes the findings of researchers like Robert Bellah and his colleagues who, in Habits of the Heart, a very important 1985 publication. Wow, if Bellah only knew, right?
That's what God says about the rejection of religion.
Yes, there you are. So Bellah describes American religious belief as things that are eclectic and pluralistic, that is, often composed of a variety of traditional public and individualized private elements. Here's another definition from philosopher Robert Solomon. He says, religion is fundamentally about belonging, and this is in keeping with one of the root etymologies of the term religion from the Latin religare, R-E-L-I-G-A-R-E, meaning to bind or to connect, bespeaking the importance of congregational bonds and communities of interpretation and validation. But as my example suggests, if we confine ourselves to religion as interpreted in this sort of conventional way, we are likely to miss a great deal. Some have tried to expand the notion of religion in existentially meaningful ways to account for this larger, non-institutional, often more individualized awareness of the transcendent, the holy, the sacred, and here's another one of our issues, right? We have a lot of ways of talking about what it is about religion or spirituality that's important. But the beginnings of the academic study of religion are marked by efforts to de-Christianize and de-theologize religion as a study of a very diverse, perhaps universal kind of phenomenon that everyone seems to be engaged in, but with lots of different forms. Now, often these efforts still worked with very explicit Judeo-Christian concepts, such as the work of the famed scholar Rudolf Otto in his book, The Idea of the Holy, Das Heilige. What he did actually is take the Old and New Testaments and concluded that the fundamental non-rational notion about the divine was something like shock and awe before a transcendent power. Other more cosmopolitan readers who were looking at religious traditions east and west, people like, let's say, Marci Eliade at the University of Chicago, took a comparative approach and sought to isolate sort of essentials of religion that they believed were fundamental in every expression. So people like Eliade would talk about the distinction between the sacred and the profane as really one of the key elements to understand here. Well, even Christian theologians were not freed from this effort to try to understand in a broader way what religion was about. Think here about Paul Tillich, the Protestant theologian, who gave the label of religion to anything that turned out to be a person's ultimate concern. These are all imaginative and expansive reconstructions of religion, but they have not forestalled the real need to have a different coinage. And I think for better or for worse, we all now accept the notion of spirituality as an additional element in this mix and talk about it as a meaningful term. Now back to Robert Solomon. He describes spirituality as a mode of being in the world that provides an avenue for transcendent meaning and categories for understanding the major events in our lives. This seems to me as satisfactory a definition as any other, although, as you will readily note, it's pretty vague. Solomon's description does seem to follow what I think is customary usage, in which religion is the particularized form for beliefs and practices that have conventional names and organized traditions, such as Methodism or Orthodox Judaism. Spirituality, by contrast, is the more inclusive term, including religious traditions, but also incorporating a broad and eclectic set of beliefs and practices for which there may be no well-organized institutional component. Now, obviously, if we simply study religion in the conventional sense, we will miss a great deal. But this is not to say that some researchers may be interested in studying religion in a more precise and conventional sense and not spirituality. And of course, this is fine. For example, there are studies which seek to correlate church attendance with health status. And while these have been roundly criticized, I think justifiably on methodological grounds, I think it is still not impossible to study religious activities like attendance at worship services or praying as a human set of actions and attitudes that may have some bearing on a person's health. But of course, it is quite a different thing to study the health efficacy of prayer as a metaphysical reality. For example, the infamous studies of the Harvard researcher Herbert Benson on the health consequences of intercessory prayer. Human behaviors, I would submit, can be studied, measured, and understood, but divine causal efficacy cannot, at least scientifically. So studying religion or spirituality may require a degree of metaphysical humility, and certainly a disinterest in religious truth claims. Notice I did not say a lack of interest or uninterest, but a disinterest in religious truth claims. So, that's part one. Part two, tailoring a definition to meet a research agenda. SPAR as a subject of scholarly investigation requires, I submit, not only a broad definition, but a functional definition. I hasten to say that this may not be the kind of definition that is needed for training theology students. I argue the appropriate one the one I'm concerned about is what is the appropriate one for doing research? And again, I have in mind here fundamentally empirical research done in the clinic. So here the question is, how does SPAR come into play? What functions does it serve? Does it facilitate or drive patients away from genetic testing or counseling? Does it help or hinder? Is it beneficent or is it toxic? So this definition, like all definitions, has a particular end in mind, and the definition is, in that sense, very much goal-directed. This means we will need to know why we want the information we are seeking to gather, in terms of what uses we intend for the data. If we need a map, is it for camping or is it for interstate highway driving? If we need an accurate SPAR topography, is it because we want to convert our patients, or to advise them, or to better communicate with them? So everything I am saying assumes at least the initial priority of that last agenda, that is, the effort to better communicate and understand. This, of course, means we have to leave behind some of our hankering, and I admit I have it, and I suspect you do too, to explore or judge the truth claim of any specific spiritual or religious scheme. Okay, my third question, what work does SPAR do? If I'm emphasizing a broad definition and a functional definition, then What am I suggesting is the work or the function of SPAR that we need to look for? Well, this is a beginning sort of cut at this, and I suspect this is a point at which we will have some discussion, and which I'm not at all satisfied that I'm putting this in exactly the right way. So I hope you'll disagree with whatever I'm saying here that you find objectionable. But one important function, it seems to me, of SPAR is to provide a framework for responding to perennial and fundamental human questions, questions that are posed in individual, but also in communal ways. And I'm just going to pose these in the individual form with the implication that you could pose these in the plural, you could pose these in a community way, and they would make just as much sense. The first one is, who am I? Which is fundamentally the question of identity. The second is, how can I find meaning and hope in suffering? Which is the question of ultimate purpose. The third is, how can I come to terms with death? That is the question of finitude and the significance of my limited horizon. And the fourth is, how do I live faithfully? That is, in accord with the deepest sense of what I am called to do for myself and others, the question of responsibility. So, identity, ultimate purpose, the significance of my finitude, and the question of my responsibility. That's a kind of a beginning list. And I would say if spirituality and religion don't in some ways respond to at least some of those questions, that's a sign that we're not onto something that we want to call spirituality and religion. That's what I'm suggesting is the function of this phenomenon in human life. So the reason to study SPAR is that these constitute powerful interpretive schemes, or I really like Mary White's phrase, which you'll hear later, I think, heuristic strategies. Although I'm a little worried about strategies for reasons I'll explain later. I'm a little worried about the self-consciousness and the calculation behind both scheme and strategy. So again, some help would be most welcome. But in any case, these schemes or strategies do provide orientation points for people in crisis when they are making big decisions, facing suffering, loss, uncertainty, or death, when they need moral guidance. People bring these interpretive schemes or heuristic strategies with them to the clinic and hospital. They show up in genetic counseling sessions, in situations of diagnostic testing, and in the ideals and aspirations that people have for themselves and for their progeny. So to be ignorant of them is to be blind to some of the most important sources of patient attitudes and actions. Now, it goes without saying that genetics is also a very powerful interpretive scheme. But it's more than a scheme. Genetics is really a system. And this constitutes one of the big differences. By a system, I mean a canonized body of facts, methods, and perspectives. A system that not only affects our understanding of health and disease, but our self-understanding in profound ways, and affects our notions of free will, moral agency, responsibility for health and disease, our sense of the communities to which we belong, or those from which we are excluded, and our fate or destiny. And this shows up in lots and lots of ways for us, both inside clinical context and outside of them. I love the phrase of Barbara Rothman, who says, genetics isn't just a science, it's a way of thinking. Okay, given this, it's easy to see why spiritual or religious interpretive schemes and genetic systems of analysis will sometimes interact in ways that are complementary, sometimes clash, sometimes are just confusing. What are the implications of all this? I want to spell out three. First, a focus on God talk, and let that be a sort of shorthand for everything else that goes with traditional religious understandings, Bible reading, church attendance, and so on, okay? The focus on God talk will be important, but not quite sufficient. Investigations that probe people's sense of identity, belonging or not belonging, their sense of normalcy or deviation, their understanding of their fate or destiny, their interpretations of the meanings of their illness, are also likely to be important registers of SPAR. These concepts often constitute, in other words, spiritual or religious discourse, whether or not it is in the usual trappings. Consider the following responses from two sets of parents, both of whom have recently received a diagnosis, a prenatal diagnosis of spina bifida. One couple says, no matter what happens, it's in God's hands. A second couple says, we believe there's a reason for this. Everything happens for a reason. We just don't know what that reason is yet. Well, it seems to me that both of these statements reflect efforts to come to terms with the larger meaning of this unwelcome diagnosis, and therefore bespeak interpretive schemes which would be of interest to us in the study of spirituality and religion in genetics. The second implication, a focus on explicitly stated beliefs and formal doctrine will be important, but not sufficient. Individuals may either affirm or deviate from the formal public views of the institutional bodies to which they belong. Moreover, SPAR commitments are not all conceptual, not just thought, not all in the cortex. Some of this goes on in the gut and in the heart and are rehearsed and enacted in bodily ways. Genetic understandings resonate or fail to resonate with the larger spiritual and religious sensibilities of people, not just their beliefs or their concepts. And this can show up in some very interesting ways. For example, risk assessments, especially when they are offered as a prelude to patient choices. Risk assessments, especially when they are offered as a prelude to patient choices, may be unwelcome because they threaten a sense that leaving some things unexamined respects a providential order and design for life. This is just the reverse of the Socratic maxim, which some of in this room try to practice routinely, unsuccessfully, that everything has to be examined and looked at carefully, down to the last jot and tittle. Some religious traditions say or suggest that examining some things is inappropriate, perhaps even sinful. And in these cases, note that it's not a specific choice that one is being offered, such as termination of a pregnancy, that's problematic. Rather, simply being presented with a choice can demystify life. It can threaten the perception that life is a gift and desacralize the world by portraying it as devoid of mystery and wonder. And this kind of response, I think, is captured in yet another etymological candidate for the rootage of the word religion, religere, R-E-L-I-G-E-R-E, which means to be careful. Third implication. SPAR, like politics, is local. Nobody practices religion or spirituality. We are all Southern Baptist, or Orthodox Jews, or pantheistic Presbyterians with Buddhist leanings. Moreover, our experiences of spirituality and religion are embedded in particular ways that may turn out to be important to us, may be critical to us, like being a member of the Upper Cumberland Reformed congregation, or regulars at the Wednesday evening Dharma talk and yoga sessions. This adds a layer of complexity that we have to respect. My experience so far studying spirituality and religion in the context of healthcare decisions to date would indicate that we may not be able to forecast what will turn out to be important for any particular patient or family, or for that matter, to any particular healthcare provider. If SPAR resides not just in the cortex, but in the gut and in the imagination, and not only bodily, but is also embodied in activities like ritual, practices, then it follows that none of us actually may have transparency on our own deep convictions, attitudes, and demeanors until they are called into play or challenged. So let me end with, the end is in sight, my second cautionary tale, one about our ability to forecast or generalize about how spirituality and religion works. This is another couple in the spina bifida research trial, another couple that's trying to decide whether to have the prenatal surgical procedure that closes the back. They have been through a day and a half of information about the development of their offspring, about the risks and possible benefits of the surgery. They've looked at the data. They've talked to the psychologist. They've talked to the surgeon and the anesthesiologist. They've probably talked to somebody like Mark Blyton, you know, who counsels them in relation to the ethical qualities of the choices involved. This was a particular couple that worried about this kind of participation in the trial and really couldn't make up their mind. Finally, the key element in their decision, which was to have the procedure done, turned out to be their discovery that the name of the street on which their hotel was located was Mount Moriah Church Road. Well, this connected in their sensibility to the story in Genesis and the site on which Abraham was commanded to sacrifice his son Isaac, as you remember, only to be reprieved at the last minute when a ram shows up in the bushes next door. The couple, seeing the sign, returned to their hotel room, read their Gideon Bible, and called the study coordinator and said, "We are ready to go." Well, the logic may be clear, I think, in retrospect, but my point is, who would have imagined that the determining factor in their decision would have been a street sign? I offer this as a cautionary tale and also a kind of a plea for humility in thinking that we can know how and why spirituality and religion will influence healthcare, the decisions and attitudes of individual people, without taking the time to ask. So I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you. So Joe, we've got 5 minutes or so.
Yeah, 5, 6 minutes.
Yes, Mary.
Thanks for that. Lovely introduction. But I'd like to make it more confusing. Your last example, I think, captures my concern perfectly, which is that and this is a linguistic problem. When we speak about spar, however you want to call it, there's a kind of expectation that there is a thing there, and that if not quite static, there is still something there, sort of beliefs or something established in people's minds. What I feel we need to get at is that this is all really elusive stuff, and people's spiritual values or religious beliefs change from moment to moment often. God is with you, God is not. The street sign, whatever, you can sort of choose selectively as your life circumstances arise what it is that's going to give you guidance or meaning or your significance. And I think we need to recognize that these values are exceptionally elusive. I'm thinking of the expression tacit knowledge, tacit beliefs, that we feel more than we can say. We're often unable to articulate what it is that is moving us, what it is we really think. And if we try to articulate it, we discover we're incoherent.
Can you hear this in the back? No.
Then you get to repeat all of that.
Oh, no. Well, no, I only wanted people to be sure they hear this because, you know, if I had thought of saying it just that way, it's what I would have done. What Mary is saying is that,
Let her say it again.
great. Even better.
Word for word.
Sorry.
I'm just really concerned that when we talk about this thing called SPAR, there's sort of an assumption that we know what it is we're talking about. But in fact, I think we're dealing with something exceptionally elusive that for all of us, maybe barring a few, I can't say, but for many of us, our beliefs change from moment to moment, day to day. Whatever it is that we're dealing with will raise different kinds of issues for us, and we'll seize on different kinds of fragments of belief, if you will, to give us guidance and orientation at that time. And so if we're talking about a research definition, somehow I think we need to capture that these are fleeting ideas we're working with, not something that is well formulated, articulable, consistent, coherent, if you will, rational, that we're talking about with these values as they arise in the clinic. That this is something that is capricious and beyond our grasp largely, and yet that we all have a fundamental need to seek as we flounder our way through these things called life, this thing called life, that hands us stuff we don't know how to deal with, we can't understand. And so we look for meaning wherever we can find it, but that it's very elusive. I'm babbling now.
No, that's terrific, and I'll only say I agree with almost everything you've said. And if I had thought of some of these ways of putting it, I would have put it in my talk too. Thank you.
Any responses to how we can handle that, though, in a research context? If you're looking for definitions you can use.
Well, I think it's a kind of a caveat to all essentialist definitions of spirituality and religion. It also means, I love what you said about the idea that actually this is a changing phenomenon within individual lives over time. And what it means for any individual, at one point in time may not be what it means at some future time. So it's this dynamic quality that it has. I think that's exactly right.
I said I don't know that I know I don't have an answer to what you do about the issue raised as a clinician, but as a researcher, I think that there's something that's fairly clear, which is that Larry laid out 4 or 5 deep fundamental concerns that are spiritual and religious concerns, and then that wonderful example of the 2 couples with spina bifida. I think, to me, what it says very, very clearly is that if you ask people who've made a decision, what was your, was religion a factor in your decision, or what were your religious decisions? So you're bringing up religion, you're asking them to respond to it. You're going to miss a lot. You're going to get thin answers. If you ask them, why did you do that? And then you bring to it the frame of looking for what in there you think may be fundamental and responding to those concerns, then you have a way of teasing out this complex and local set of concerns. And I think that's incredibly, incredibly important, and I think it's really fantastic that it came up in the very first session, because I think that it's something that's going to come up again and again. Is the empirical work that's being done really taking advantage of the breadth of understanding that's being presented about what spirituality and religion are?
I was just struck by the power of stories, personal stories. It's saying a little bit of the same thing. And I'm reminded actually of my mother, who, I mean, if this isn't a terrible oxymoron, is devoutly atheistic. I mean, she's a devout atheist. And she had a hip replacement a few years ago and required a blood transfusion. and she was hysterical about getting a blood transfusion, which in retrospect, I mean, we heard doctors say is not a terribly uncommon reaction about sort of having someone else's blood, or the idea of sort of someone else's spirit living in her was horribly traumatic for her, the prospect of. And my point is that it was a shock to her family members. It's not only elusive between clinicians and patients. The people that you think you know extremely well, you can't predict what it is that's going to make them react a certain way. And I think, to sort of add to what Nancy's saying, I would actually think that researchers might benefit from telling stories like that to people they're studying. Because people may not even be able to articulate what it is that's making them react a certain way. But if you give examples to people, you know, we're so worried about this notion of contamination and inflicting a particular belief on someone else. And I actually think that there's a way of inviting stories through the use of stories.
Or maybe you're giving permission to talk in this way.
Doctor, can I just make a couple comments? First of all, I'm not in favor of the acronym SPAR. In fact, I'm not in favor of acronyms at all anymore because it's becoming a language that many of us don't understand unless we're in the group that uses those words. So I'm not really in favor of the word SPAR. Spirituality and religion kind of deliver a message that is important for all people, and all people can understand in some means or some way. But if SPAR does become a used acronym, I'll know the meaning of it. I don't know how long. The older I get, the less I remember. But anyway, beyond that, I think that I certainly enjoyed your talk. I think that my whole life I tried to put into my inner being what you seem to announce in your talk and what you seem to point out. And yet I wrestle with many of the things that people you used as examples with wrestle. And I wrestle in trying to help people to get to the point to make decisions that they have to make regarding their health. And I think that when we look at research and we try to equate the biological research to the spirituality and religious research, there's a big divide there. And because religion and spirituality, whether the person has an organization that they belong to, or they follow, or they practice, I don't know that they're devoid even of some principle of basic spirituality. And I think that what I found in your talk was that in our zeal to try to help these people make decisions, we sometimes get too affluent with our knowledge base. And I think that what we look for, what people have to remember, and what we have to search out among ourselves is how do you get across to the man who doesn't have the formal background or understanding or thought process that we seem to have or try to present in helping them. So I think I got lost in your talk many times. I think I got confused in some respects. And I often see that when I'm trying to help people make decisions, when they have to decide as basic thing like, do I get tested or do I not get tested? If I get tested, what does it mean for me? And what does it mean for someone else? And, you know, that's just where I'm at. I think that I enjoyed listening to you, but I think I'm a bit more confused.
Thank you.
John Phillips, may I just respond as a retired naval officer that I did like the acronym, and I like it because let me clarify why I like it and see if you a SPAR is actually, its function is to support a sale. And a sales function is to capture either I'm not going to use the term hot air, but I'm going to use the term a breeze or wind. And I think this is the idea that we all believe in wind, but we can't see it and we can't draw a picture of it.
The biblical word for wind is ruach, which is spirit.
Yes. So that's the naval take on it.
Thank you.
I had a comment in regard to your street sign. Excuse me, I didn't stand up. I had a comment in regard to your street sign. I'm a person of putting out fleeces all the time, so that one made perfect sense to me personally. But in regard to the position of the one trying to help make the decision, I had a story I wanted to share. I had a friend when I was growing up who was not even 5 foot in heels. And this little gal, when she grew up, became pregnant with quadruplets. And we were quite concerned, especially when the report came that one of the quadruplets was not developing. And her father, who was himself a minister, came to my mother and asked her to pray for the quadruplet that was not developing. And, I mean, you can say empirically, well, some element of development was reached and the child grew, but in any case, my mother prayed prior to the event of the child growing to match the other quadruplets. Therefore, every time I saw this man afterwards, he would always say to me, your mother prayed and this quadruplet grew and developed and was viable. I think the problem with that is, what if the alternative had occurred? And the position that we're put in sometimes as sacerdote, as the one closer to God than the person in question. I think we have to be careful about taking on the sacerdotal position to where the person does not feel it is truly their decision and their action, but where they feel like they did it because of your statement, because of your relationship with God.
No, I just want to thank people for the comments and the excellent suggestions. But it's time for a break, right? Time for a break. Okay.